Good morning and welcome to this morning's reflection. And this morning we come to look at the question, was Jesus a political figure? Did he intend to have a political influence? We are going to be looking at this question through the eyes of Albert Nolan, who's going to perhaps draw out some of the attitudes of the day to help us better understand Jesus' position during these very turbulent times. One of the things we can be most certain about, because it's a well-attested fact, that Jesus of Nazareth was tried, sentenced, and executed by the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate on a charge of high treason. Now, this did not make him unique, for thousands of Jewish rebels and revolutionaries were indeed crucified by the Roman rulers of Palestine during this time. The Jews, on the whole, as we've seen in previous readings by Albert Nolan, the Jews on the whole were opposed to Roman rule, and some of them were intent on overthrowing the Romans and restoring the kingdom of Israel. Now, Jesus was found guilty of being involved in some such conspiracy, and moreover, of claiming to be the rightful king of the Jews, the heir to the throne, or what the Jews would have called the Messiah. When Jesus hung on the cross, the Roman soldiers placed above him the sign, the King of the Jews, and this inscription leaves no doubt at all about the charge that was being brought against him at that time. So, the question is, was Jesus guilty of revolutionary activity? Did he incite the people to revolt? Did he oppose the payment of taxes to the Roman government? Did he claim to be the king or the Messiah who would rule over the Jews instead of Herod or Pilate or Caesar? Did he plan to overthrow the government? You see, at one extreme, we have those who maintain that he was guilty, or at least as far as the Roman authorities were concerned, because he did claim to be the Messiah. He did want to start a revolution in some way to overthrow the Roman imperialists. It is argued that Jesus was deeply involved in the politics of the time, and that he started a religious type of political movement, well, not unlike that of the Zealots, because the similarities between Jesus and the Zealots are very heavily underlined. One of the 12 was known as Simon the Zealot, and it is sometimes argued that Peter, Judas, and even the sons of Zebedee were also zealots. Some years after the death of Jesus, a leading Pharisee who was actually on the side of this Jesus movement and wanted to give them a chance, presumed that it was something like the zealot movement of Judas the Galilean. And at one time, St. Paul was mistaken for a well-known revolutionary leader from Egypt, underscoring the view at the time that this Jesus movement was somehow revolutionary. So, at the other extreme, we have those who maintain that Jesus was completely innocent, that he never had any such intention, that he did not wish to incite people to revolt, and that in fact he told them to pay their taxes, that he was a pacifist, and he claimed to be the spiritual Messiah or the spiritual king of the Jews, that he wanted nothing to do with the politics of the day, that he preached a purely spiritual message, and that political changes were political charges were fabricated by the Jewish leaders who wanted, in fact, to do away with him, and that they had made up all this political stuff. The truth does not lie somewhere in between these two extremes. The truth of the matter is that both views are an attempt to read back into history the events of the past through the eyes of the present. The truth of the matter is that the Jews made no distinction at all between politics and religion. Issues which we today would say are definitely political, or we might classify things as political, social, economic, or religious, would have been thought of then in terms of God and the law. In those days, a purely secular problem would have been completely inconceivable. A cursory glance at the Old Testament alone would make this quite clear. Nevertheless, it is possible for us to say that some of the issues of the time were what we would call political, provided we remember that for the Jews of that time these issues would have been conceived of in terms of their religion. In this sense, it is possible to say that the relationship of Israel to the imperial power of Rome was a political issue, or if you like, a religio-political issue. If Jesus differed from the Zealots on this matter, he could not possibly have done so merely because he wanted to keep out of politics. For the Jews, it was a religious matter, and a religious person would be expected to have an opinion about it just as much as they would be expected to have an opinion about the Sabbath or about fasting. There can be no doubt that Jesus was concerned about the people who were oppressed by the Romans. But he went about attempting to free the people very differently. He set out to liberate Israel from Rome by persuading Israel to change. Without a change of heart within Israel itself, liberation from imperialism of any kind would be impossible. And that had been the message of all the prophets, including John the Baptist. Jesus was a prophet, and he was involved in politics in exactly the same way as all the prophets had been. So what kind of change would liberate Israel? He went to a great deal of trouble to persuade the Jews of Palestine that their present attitude of resentment and bitterness was suicidal. And so he told them to read the signs of the times and to judge for themselves, instead of relying upon what the Zealots and the others told them. In the context, these signs are the signs of an impending catastrophe. the clouds looming up in the west. This catastrophe is described most consistently as a military defeat for Israel in which Jerusalem would be surrounded by her enemies. And no assessment of the situation could have been more at variance with the expectations of the zealots. Jesus was saying, unless you change, you will be destroyed, because they would not be able to overthrow the Romans in a military battle. They would not be able to win their case against their opponents. And so Jesus saw that entering into a war was no way to achieve liberation. Liberation would be achieved by change of the heart, not change of outside conditions. And it's good for us to remember that when we try in our own way to institute revolution. Amen.